He thought humiliating her would be just another ordinary Monday. But he had no idea he was about to lose everything he had built. The metallic clink of a car key hitting polished marble echoed louder than it should have. And in that single suspended second, every conversation in the room died as heads turned toward the sound, toward the young woman standing near the conference table, her posture calm, her expression unreadable, while Richard Lawson, department head, untouchable authority, the man who controlled promotions, budgets, and reputations, froze mid-sentence, his confident smile faltering for the first time in years. 3 days earlier, no one had noticed Emily Carter when she first walked into the building, a quiet intern in a simple navy blouse and worn leather flats, carrying a notebook like it mattered more than her presence, blending into the background of a corporate world built on sharp suits and louder voices. The office itself gleamed with polished glass walls and neatly aligned desks, the kind of place where status was measured in corner offices and who got to speak first in meetings. And at the center of it all stood Richard Lawson, a man whose tailored charcoal suits and measured tone made people listen before he even spoke, a man who had long learned that authority didn't need to shout. It simply needed to be believed. Emily had watched silently that first morning, her eyes steady as she took in the rhythm of the office, the subtle glances employees exchanged before answering Richard, the way laughter always followed his jokes even when they weren't funny, the way silence fell when he entered a room, as if the air itself adjusted to his presence. "You're the new intern?" he had asked without looking up from his tablet, his voice flat, already dismissive, and when she nodded, he gave a short, almost amused breath. "Just stay out of the way and do what you're told. That'll make things easier for everyone." A few nearby employees smirked, not cruelly, but comfortably, as if they had heard this before, as if this was simply how things worked here. Emily had said nothing, only nodded again, her hands steady, her eyes revealing nothing. But in that moment something quiet settled beneath the surface, something patient. Throughout that first day, she moved through tasks with quiet precision, organizing files, delivering reports, absorbing everything without asking questions, unnoticed except when something needed to be done, exactly how Richard preferred it, exactly how the system was designed to keep people like her invisible. But it wasn't the paperwork that caught her attention. It was the small inconsistencies, the details most people overlooked, the way Richard casually mentioned weekend meetings that never appeared on the official schedule, the way a sleek black company car was always missing from the lot at times it shouldn't be, the way expense reports carried signatures that seemed just slightly too routine, too practiced. None of it was obvious, not at first glance. But Emily wasn't looking at first glance, she was watching patterns. And patterns had a way of revealing truths people believed were hidden. Still, she kept her head down, because in a place like this, speaking too soon meant being dismissed before you were heard. And Richard Lawson had built his power on that exact principle, on the assumption that no one beneath him would ever dare connect the dots. Back in the present, the room remained frozen, the faint hum of the air conditioning suddenly loud in the silence. And as Richard slowly turned his gaze toward Emily, something unfamiliar flickered in his expression, not anger, not yet, but uncertainty, the kind that comes when control begins to slip in ways you didn't anticipate. And Emily, still calm, still composed, met his eyes without a trace of hesitation, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment all along. Richard Lawson had built his reputation on control, and control meant never allowing a crack to show. So when the room fell into that heavy, unnatural silence, he did what he had done for years. He straightened his posture, adjusted the cuff of his tailored sleeve, and forced a thin smile as if nothing had shifted, as if the faint tremor in the air existed only in imagination. "Is there something you would like to share, Emily?" he asked, his tone measured but edged with irritation, the kind that warned more than it questioned, and a few employees shifted in their seats, eyes flickering between them, sensing something unusual but not yet understanding its weight. Emily did not rush to answer, and that pause stretched just long enough to feel intentional, just long enough to make Richard's confidence feel slightly misplaced. Before she finally spoke, her voice calm, steady, and unexpectedly clear for someone who had barely spoken in meetings before. "I believe there are details about company asset usage that should be clarified. and the phrasing alone caused a subtle ripple across the room. Not dramatic, not loud, but enough for people to exchange glances, because in this office, no one used words like that without consequence. Richard let out a soft, dismissive chuckle, leaning back slightly in his chair as if indulging a minor inconvenience. "You are an intern," he said, emphasizing each word with quiet precision, "and I would advise you to focus on tasks appropriate to your role." A few nervous laughs followed, automatic, conditioned, but weaker than usual, as if the room itself was no longer fully aligned with him. Emily lowered her gaze briefly, not in submission, but in calculation, her fingers resting lightly on the notebook she carried everywhere, and for a moment it looked like she might step back, might retreat into the silence expected of her. Exactly the outcome Richard relied on, exactly the pattern that had protected him, time and time again. But then she looked up again, and this time there was something different, something steady and unmovable behind her eyes. "I understand my role," she replied, "and I also understand company policy." The words landed softly but carried a weight that did not belong to someone being dismissed, and the room felt it, even if no one spoke. Richard's smile tightened, the kind that never reached his eyes, and he leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice as if attempting to reassert control without drawing further attention. "Be careful," he said, just loud enough for those closest to hear. "Confidence without experience can be embarrassing." And that word hung there, deliberate, meant to shrink her back into place, meant to remind her of the hierarchy she was expected to respect. But Emily did not flinch, and that was the first real fracture, because in a system built on silent compliance, hesitation was the signal of power, and she offered none. Instead, she opened her notebook slowly, deliberately, the soft sound of paper shifting somehow louder than it should have been, and several employees leaned forward without realizing it, drawn in by a tension they could not name. 3 days earlier, she had stood in the same parking structure just after 6 in the evening, watching the last few employees leave, the fluorescent lights casting long reflections across the concrete floor, when she noticed the black company sedan pulling out of its reserved spot, the driver unmistakable even at a distance. Richard Lawson did not notice her then, did not think to look, because why would he? An intern blending into shadows did not register as a risk, not in his world. That first moment had not been enough to mean anything, not on its own. But Emily had learned long ago that truth rarely revealed itself in a single event. It lived in repetition, in patterns that people assumed no one would track. And over the next few days, she watched, quietly, carefully, noting times, noting destinations, noticing the subtle inconsistencies between official schedules and actual movement. The kind of details most people ignored because they trusted the system to regulate itself. Back in the conference room, as she turned a page in her notebook, the faint rustle seemed to echo across the polished surfaces, and for the first time, Richard Lawson felt something he had not felt in years. Not fear, not yet, but the unmistakable sensation that the narrative he controlled was beginning to shift beyond his reach. And around them, the room held its breath, waiting, because something had already changed, even if no one had said it out loud. The moment Emily turned that page, something invisible shifted in the room, like a quiet line had been crossed that no one could uncross. And even though no one spoke, the attention that had once belonged entirely to Richard Lawson now began to drift, slowly but unmistakably, toward her. Richard noticed it. Of course he did. A man like him always noticed shifts in control, and he leaned forward again, his voice firmer now, sharper. "If you have something to say, then say it clearly," he stated, no longer masking the irritation beneath his professionalism. And this time there were no nervous laughs, only stillness, because the room had already begun to sense that this was no longer routine. Emily nodded once, not submissively, but as if acknowledging the invitation she had been waiting for, and she reached into her folder, sliding out a thin stack of printed documents, placing them carefully on the polished table, aligning the edges with deliberate precision, each movement controlled, unhurried, and somehow more commanding than any raised voice. "These are vehicle usage logs from the past 2 weeks," she said, her tone even, her words chosen with care. "And these are corresponding access records from the parking structure," she added, placing a second set beside the first. The quiet sound of paper against wood echoing softly in the silence, and a few heads leaned forward instinctively, drawn by the specificity, by the quiet confidence in her voice. Richard's expression did not change immediately, but there was a flicker, a brief tightening around his eyes, the kind that revealed calculation beneath composure. Interns do not have access to this level of documentation, he replied, his voice controlled, but colder now, which raises a more serious question about how you obtained it. And there it was, the first attempt to redirect, to shift focus away from the content and toward her authority to present it. Emily met his gaze without hesitation. All documents were retrieved through publicly accessible internal systems, she said, with permissions assigned to my role for administrative support. And the clarity of her response left little room for dismissal, because she had anticipated this, had prepared for it, had removed the easiest path of escape before stepping into the moment. A murmur passed quietly between two employees near the end of the table, quickly silenced, but not unnoticed, because doubt, once introduced, had a way of spreading without permission. Emily continued, turning one of the pages toward the center of the table. According to these logs, the company vehicle assigned to executive use was checked out on 4 separate occasions outside of scheduled business operations, she explained, her finger resting lightly on the timestamps. Each instance occurring between Friday evening and Sunday night. She paused, just long enough for the pattern to settle in the minds of those listening. However, there are no corresponding entries in official meeting records, client visits, or approved off-site engagements. And now the silence felt heavier, because this was no longer abstract. It was structured, specific, undeniable in its logic. Richard let out a slow breath, leaning back again, attempting to reclaim the space through posture alone. You are making assumptions based on incomplete data, he said, his tone firm, authoritative, the voice of someone used to ending conversations rather than engaging in them. Executive responsibilities often require discretion, he added, as if the explanation itself should be sufficient. But Emily did not interrupt, did not argue. She simply turned another page, revealing a series of printed still images, grainy but clear enough to identify, timestamps visible in the corner. These are security camera captures from the parking structure during those same time frames, she said, her voice unchanged, steady. The vehicle is consistently accessed by the same individual. She paused again, and this time she did not need to finish the sentence, because everyone in the room understood what she was implying. A chair creaked softly as someone shifted their weight, the smallest sound suddenly amplified by tension, and for the first time, Richard did not respond immediately, his silence stretching just a fraction too long, just enough to be noticed. Emily closed her notebook gently, her hands resting on its cover, and in that quiet, controlled stillness, she had done something no one else in that room had ever managed to do. She had forced the conversation out of Richard Lawson's control and into the open, where facts did not bend to authority, and where, slowly but inevitably, the truth began to take shape. The silence that followed was no longer passive. It was heavy, deliberate, the kind that presses against your chest and refuses to let anyone breathe normally. And Richard Lawson felt it, not as a loud disruption, but as a subtle erosion of something he had always relied on, unquestioned authority. He cleared his throat, a small, controlled gesture, and leaned forward again, folding his hands together as if reassembling the structure that had just been shaken. Security footage can be misleading, he said, his voice calm but carrying a sharper edge now. Angles, timing, incomplete context. These things can easily be misunderstood. And for a brief moment, it almost worked, because uncertainty is a powerful tool when facts feel just out of reach. A few employees nodded faintly, not in agreement but in habit, conditioned to accept his explanations before questioning them. But the hesitation in their eyes lingered longer this time, and that hesitation was new. Emily did not rush to respond. She simply reached for another sheet, sliding it forward with the same quiet precision. I anticipated that concern, she said, her tone unchanged. So I cross-referenced vehicle mileage with fuel transaction records. And as she spoke, she turned the document so it faced the group, revealing neatly aligned entries, dates, locations, times, all matching too closely to be coincidence. Each instance corresponds with fuel purchases made outside the city, approximately 30 to 40 miles from the office, she continued, her voice steady. Locations that do not match any registered client sites or company-approved travel routes. And now the room shifted again, chairs creaking softly, someone exhaling under their breath. Because this was no longer a matter of interpretation, it was pattern layered upon pattern, evidence building in a way that could not easily be dismissed. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, the first visible crack in his composure, and he sat back again. Slower this time, as if buying himself a moment to recalibrate. Even if that were true, he replied, choosing his words carefully, it does not prove misuse. Executives are often required to handle sensitive matters off record. And there it was again, the appeal to authority, the suggestion that his position itself justified what could not be explained. Emily nodded once, acknowledging the statement without conceding to it, and then she reached into her folder one final time, retrieving a small envelope, placing it gently on the table, its presence understated but somehow heavier than the documents before it. I also reviewed expense reimbursements submitted during those same time frames, she said, her voice lowering just slightly, not for effect, but because the room had already leaned in. And I found repeated entries for personal dining and recreational venues charged under client entertainment. She paused, letting the words settle, letting their meaning expand in the silence. Locations that, according to company policy, require documented client attendance. And then, with deliberate calm, she opened the envelope, sliding out printed receipts, each one marked, each one aligned with the data she had already presented. A faint murmur rippled across the room, no longer contained, no longer controlled, because the pieces were connecting now, not just in logic but in perception, and once perception shifted, authority followed. Richard did not speak immediately this time, and that silence was different. It was not strategic, not measured. It was reactive, the kind that comes when the next move is no longer clear. And for the first time, he was not directing the pace of the conversation, he was trying to keep up with it. Across the table, Emily remained still, her hands resting lightly against the folder, her posture composed, her expression calm. But there was something unmistakable in the way she held herself now. Something that no longer resembled the quiet intern who had walked into the building unnoticed just days ago. Because she had not raised her voice, she had not argued, she had not needed to. She had simply allowed the truth to assemble itself piece by piece until it could no longer be ignored. And in that moment, the balance of the room shifted fully, not through confrontation, but through clarity, and clarity, once seen, does not easily fade. The room no longer belonged to Richard Lawson, even if no one had said it aloud. Because authority does not disappear in a single moment. It erodes quietly, piece by piece, and what remained of his control now felt fragile, balanced on the edge of something he could not easily contain. He inhaled slowly, his fingers pressing together against the polished surface of the table, grounding himself in the familiar rhythm of composure. And when he finally spoke, his voice returned with a sharper clarity, not as confident as before, but more deliberate, more calculated. You have clearly put effort into compiling this, he said, choosing neutrality as a shield. But you are interpreting data without understanding executive discretion. And for a brief moment, it sounded convincing again, because confidence, even when weakened, still carries weight in a room conditioned to follow it. However, this time the silence that followed his words was different. It did not reinforce him. It questioned him, and several pairs of eyes shifted not toward him, but toward Emily, waiting, expecting, as if the center of gravity had already changed. Emily did not rush to answer, and that restraint only deepened the tension. Because she was no longer reacting, she was guiding, and after a brief pause, she spoke again, her voice calm, unwavering. I understand discretion, she said. But company policy requires documentation when company resources are used for purposes not directly tied to scheduled business operations. She let the statement settle, not as an accusation, but as a principle, something that existed beyond either of them, something that could not be dismissed as opinion. Richard's expression hardened slightly, the faintest tightening at the corners of his mouth, and he leaned forward again, his tone lowering as if attempting to contain the situation before it spread further. "You are overstepping," he said, quieter now, but more direct. "This is not your responsibility." And there it was again, the attempt to reduce her position, to pull her back into the role he understood, the role that kept everything predictable. But Emily did not retreat, and that refusal was no longer subtle. It was clear, unmistakable. She met his gaze steadily and replied, "It became my responsibility when the discrepancies affected internal reporting, and the phrasing shifted everything, because now it was not about authority or hierarchy. It was about impact, about the system itself." A senior manager at the far end of the table shifted in his seat, clearing his throat softly, as if preparing to speak but hesitating, caught between old loyalties and new uncertainty. And that hesitation did not go unnoticed, not by Richard, and certainly not by Emily. She continued, her movements slow, controlled, as she turned to the final document in her folder. "There is one more detail," she said, and the way she said it, without emphasis, without dramatics, made it feel heavier than anything before. "The vehicle usage logs are automatically linked to key card access," she explained, "which means each instance is tied to a specific identification badge." She paused, just long enough for the implication to settle across the room. "And all entries correspond to a single badge," she finished, her voice steady, her eyes never leaving his. The air in the room seemed to still completely. Even the faint hum of the lights felt distant now. And for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, because the final piece had been placed. And it did not require interpretation, it required acknowledgment. Richard Lawson, for the first time since the meeting began, did not respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the documents in front of him, his mind moving through possibilities that no longer offered clear exits. And that pause, that silence, stretched longer than any before it, long enough for everyone in the room to feel it, to recognize it, because power does not vanish with a shout. It disappears in moments like this, when the person who once controlled every conversation no longer knows what to say. Next, and across from him, Emily Carter remained still, composed, her presence no longer quiet in the way it had been before, but quiet in a different sense now, the kind of quiet that carries certainty, the kind that does not need to raise its voice to be heard. And in that stillness, the truth stood on its own, no longer hidden, no longer uncertain, simply there, undeniable, waiting for the room to catch up to what it already knew. It was the silence that confirmed it, not the documents, not the data, but the absence of denial. Because in a room where Richard Lawson had always responded instantly, where his words used to fill every gap before doubt could take hold, his hesitation now spoke louder than anything he could have said. He finally lifted his gaze, but the confidence that once defined him had shifted into something tighter, more guarded. And when he spoke, his voice carried a controlled firmness that felt rehearsed even as it left his mouth. "Access badges can be shared," he said, each word measured, deliberate. "It is not uncommon for assistants or staff to handle logistical tasks on behalf of executives." And for a brief second, it created space again, a narrow opening where uncertainty could return, where the narrative might still bend back into something manageable. A few heads nodded faintly, not in agreement, but in hope, because people often prefer a simpler explanation when the alternative feels too disruptive. Emily listened without interrupting, her posture unchanged, her hands resting lightly against the folder. And when he finished, she gave a small, almost respectful nod, as if acknowledging the possibility he presented, but not accepting it. "That is correct," she said, her tone calm. "And that is why I reviewed badge access timing alongside vehicle ignition logs." And the moment those words settled, the fragile space he had created collapsed again, because she had already anticipated the explanation before he could use it. She turned one final sheet toward the center of the table, her movements steady, precise. "The ignition system requires direct key authentication linked to the assigned badge holder," she explained. "And in each instance, the activation occurs within seconds of badge entry, with no secondary access recorded." She paused, letting the technical detail translate itself into something simpler, something undeniable, which means the same individual both accessed the vehicle and operated it. And this time, no one shifted, no one murmured, because the room had reached a point where even the smallest sound felt inappropriate. Richard's expression did not fully break, but something behind it did, something internal, something that could not be hidden by posture or tone, and he looked down briefly at the documents, not to examine them, but to gather himself, to find a response that still carried authority. But when he looked up again, the room had already changed. The eyes that once followed him now watched him, not with deference, but with expectation, waiting to see what he would do next. Across the table, one of the senior directors leaned forward slightly, his voice careful, neutral, but no longer passive. "Richard," he said, using his first name for the first time in the meeting, a subtle but significant shift. "Can you clarify these discrepancies?" And that question, simple as it was, marked the turning point completely, because it no longer came from Emily. It came from within his own level of authority, from someone who had once stood beside him, not opposite him. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but the words did not come immediately, and that delay, that visible pause, settled heavily across the room, confirming what no one had yet said aloud, that control had already slipped beyond his reach. Emily remained still, her presence quiet but no longer invisible, because she was no longer the center of attention by effort. She was the center by consequence, and she did not press further, did not speak again, because she did not need to. The truth had reached a point where it no longer required her voice to carry it forward. The documents lay on the table between them, no longer just paper, but evidence of something larger, something structural, something that could not be dismissed as misunderstanding or oversight. And in that moment, the room was no longer deciding whether something had happened, it was deciding what to do about it. And as that realization settled, the balance shifted completely, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a quiet, undeniable recognition that the authority which once defined Richard Lawson had been built on something far less stable than it appeared, and now, under the weight of clarity, it could no longer hold. The question hung in the air longer than anyone expected, simple in its wording yet heavy with implication, and for Richard Lawson, it was no longer about managing perception. It was about responding to something that had already been seen, already been understood. He shifted slightly in his chair, the subtle movement betraying the pressure building beneath his composed exterior, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried less certainty than before. "There are circumstances that require flexibility," he began, choosing his words carefully. "Situations where strict adherence to policy may not reflect the full scope of executive responsibility." And while the sentence sounded structured, even authoritative, it lacked the finality it once had. It sounded like explanation, not control. Across the table, the senior director did not immediately respond, but his gaze remained fixed, steady, waiting, and that waiting was different from before. It was no longer deferential, it was evaluative, as if weighing not just the answer, but the man delivering it. Another manager shifted forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his voice quieter but firm enough to carry. "Are you saying these uses were approved?" he asked, and the question narrowed the space further, removing the comfort of abstraction, demanding something specific, something accountable. Richard hesitated again, just for a fraction of a second, but enough for everyone to notice, enough for the pattern to confirm itself. And in that moment, the room understood something collectively, that the authority they had relied on was not responding with clarity because clarity did not support it. Emily remained silent, her role now complete in a way that required no further action, because the conversation had moved beyond her, into the structure of the organization itself, where accountability no longer depended on who spoke, but on what had already been revealed. The documents lay undisturbed on the table, their presence steady, unchanging. A quiet reminder that facts do not adjust themselves to fit comfort. Richard exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, the first visible sign that the weight of the situation had settled fully. And when he spoke again, his voice had changed, not dramatically, but enough to be felt. Some of those instances were personal, he admitted, the word itself landing carefully, as if minimizing its own impact. But they did not interfere with operational performance, he added quickly. attempting to reclaim some measure of justification, some ground that still felt defensible. The room did not react immediately, but the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was decisive, because the admission, even partial, had shifted the conversation from possibility to confirmation. The senior director leaned back slightly, his expression composed but no longer neutral. "That is not the standard we are discussing," he said, his tone measured. "Company resources are not allocated based on whether misuse affects performance." And the statement, calm and precise, removed the last layer of ambiguity, leaving only the core issue exposed. A quiet tension spread across the room, not chaotic, not loud, but structured, like something formal taking shape, something procedural. And for the first time since the meeting began, Richard did not attempt to interrupt, did not attempt to redirect, because the direction no longer belonged to him. Emily glanced briefly at the documents before her, then back up, not to speak, but to observe, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, because she had not come to win an argument. She had come to reveal a truth, and now that truth was being acknowledged by the very system that had once overlooked it. The air in the room felt different now, clearer in a way that was both uncomfortable and necessary, and as the silence settled once more, it carried a new meaning, not confusion, not tension, but recognition, the kind that marks the exact moment when a narrative ends and accountability begins. And in that moment, there was no longer any question about what had happened, only what would happen next. The shift was no longer subtle. It had settled fully into the room like a new reality no one could ignore. And with that shift came something far more powerful than accusation. It brought process, structure, consequence. The senior director glanced briefly at the other members seated around the table, a silent exchange passing between them, not spoken but understood, and then he reached forward, pulling the stack of documents closer, his movements calm, deliberate, as if confirming what had already been decided internally. "We will need to review this formally," he said, his voice steady, not raised, not dramatic, but carrying the unmistakable tone of procedure beginning to take hold. "This includes a full audit of vehicle usage, expense reporting, and access logs." And the words did not sound like a suggestion. They sounded like the start of something irreversible. Richard Lawson sat still, his posture no longer commanding the space as it once had, his hands now resting flat against the table, fingers slightly spread, as if grounding himself against something that was no longer within his control. And for a brief moment, he glanced toward the far end of the room, perhaps searching for support, for alignment, for someone to interrupt or redirect, but no one did, because silence, once again, had chosen its side. Another executive spoke, this time from across the table, her tone composed but firm. "Until that review is completed, it would be appropriate to suspend discretionary access to company assets," she stated, and though the sentence was delivered without hostility, its implication was unmistakable. It marked a boundary, a removal, a quiet but definitive shift in authority. A faint sound of a chair adjusting broke the stillness as someone shifted their weight, not out of discomfort, but out of recognition, because moments like this are rarely loud. They do not arrive with dramatic declarations. They arrive with calm decisions that carry lasting impact. Richard inhaled slowly, his chest rising just slightly, and when he exhaled, there was a subtle change, not surrender, not fully, but an awareness that the path forward had narrowed beyond negotiation. "I understand," he said, his voice lower, now controlled but lacking the edge it once carried. And in those two words, the room heard what had not been said directly, acknowledgment. Emily remained where she stood, her presence steady but no longer central, because the weight of the moment had shifted away from her and into the system itself, into the structure that now moved forward on its own. And she did not step back, did not step forward. She simply remained, observing, as the outcome she had set in motion unfolded without her needing to guide it further. The documents remained spread across the table, no longer just evidence, but reference points in a process that had already begun to formalize, each page representing not just information, but accountability. And around them, the room carried a different kind of silence now, one that was no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but resolved. the kind that follows clarity when it can no longer be denied. The senior director closed the top folder gently, the soft sound, marking a quiet transition, and he looked toward Richard once more, not with confrontation, but with expectation of compliance. "We will coordinate next steps with compliance and human resources," he said, and with that, the conversation moved beyond discussion into action, beyond doubt into consequence. And in that moment, without raised voices, without dramatic confrontation, everything had changed. Because the authority that once filled the room had not been taken, it had been replaced. Quietly, completely, by something stronger, something that does not rely on position or perception, but on truth, and truth, once revealed, does not need to argue to be believed. The meeting did not end with a loud conclusion or a dramatic exit. It ended with quiet movements, chairs sliding back against the polished floor, folders being gathered, voices lowered to near whispers as people processed what had just unfolded, because what they had witnessed was not just a policy violation, it was a shift in the structure they had long accepted without question. Richard Lawson remained seated a moment longer than everyone else, his hands still resting on the table where the documents lay, as if letting go of that position required more than simply standing up, and when he finally rose, the movement felt measured, controlled, but noticeably slower, as though each step now carried weight it had never carried before. No one rushed to speak to him. No one offered the usual affirmations or casual remarks that once followed every meeting, and that absence, more than anything, marked the distance that had formed in a matter of minutes. Across the room, the senior director spoke quietly with another executive, their voices low but purposeful, already discussing timelines, procedures, the next steps that would formalize what had begun here. Because once a process like this started, it did not rely on personalities, it followed its own path. Emily stood near the edge of the table, her folder now closed, her hands resting lightly against it, her posture unchanged, but her presence no longer overlooked. And for the first time since she had entered the company, people looked at her directly, not out of curiosity, not out of dismissal, but with recognition, the kind that comes when someone alters the course of a moment without raising their voice. One of the managers approached her hesitantly, his expression careful, almost uncertain. "You put this together on your own?" he asked, his tone quiet, as if the question itself required respect, and Emily met his gaze calmly. "I followed the data," she replied, her answer simple, without embellishment, because the truth did not need decoration. The manager nodded slowly, absorbing that, then stepped back, as if understanding that there was nothing more to add. Near the doorway, Richard paused briefly, his hand resting against the frame, and for a moment it seemed as though he might turn back, might say something to reclaim even a fraction of what had been lost, but he did not. Instead, he continued forward, leaving the room without another word, and the quiet that followed his departure was different, not tense, not uncertain, but settled, as if something unresolved had finally reached its conclusion. Outside the conference room, the office carried on in its usual rhythm, keyboards clicking, phones ringing, conversations flowing. But beneath that normalcy, something had shifted, something subtle but lasting, because moments like this do not announce themselves loudly. They embed themselves into the culture of a place, altering how people see, how they question, how they choose to remain silent or speak. Emily stepped away from the table and walked toward the window at the far end of the room, the afternoon light casting long reflections across the glass, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to pause, not in celebration, not in relief, but in acknowledgment, because what she had done was not about winning. It was about refusing to ignore what she knew was true. Behind her, the quiet murmur of executives continued, plans forming, actions taking shape, and the system, once passive, now moved with intention, because the truth had done what it always does when given space. It had reshaped the room, and as Emily turned back toward the door, her expression remained steady, unchanged, because she had never needed recognition to act. She had only needed clarity, and now that clarity had found its place, not in words, not in arguments, but in the quiet, undeniable shift of everything that followed. The following morning arrived without announcement, yet everything in the office felt subtly different. as if the events from the previous day had settled into the walls overnight, reshaping the space in ways no one openly acknowledged, but everyone quietly understood. Conversations were softer, glances more deliberate, and the usual rhythm of authority had been replaced by something more cautious, more aware. Emily Carter stepped through the glass doors at exactly 8:15, her pace steady, her expression unchanged, carrying the same notebook she always carried, as if nothing about her routine had shifted, even though everything around her had. A few heads turned as she walked past the reception area, not with curiosity this time, but with recognition, the kind that follows when someone becomes impossible to overlook. She reached her desk and set her folder down gently, the familiar motion grounding her in the ordinary, because for her, this was never about disruption, it was about alignment, about ensuring that what was visible matched what was true. Across the office, a quiet tension lingered around Richard Lawson's empty office, the door closed, the blinds partially drawn, and though no announcement had been made, the absence itself spoke clearly, louder than any formal statement could have. Employees moved past it carefully, not slowing, not staring, but aware, as if the space had shifted from a place of authority to something undefined, something unresolved. Near mid-morning, a message appeared on internal systems, brief and formal, stating that administrative review procedures had been initiated regarding departmental operations, and while it did not mention names, it did not need to, because the context had already been established, the connections already made. Emily read the message without reaction, her eyes scanning the words once before returning to her work, her focus steady, because the process now unfolding was no longer hers to guide. It belonged to the system she had trusted to respond once given the truth. A colleague approached her desk quietly, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "You knew this would happen?" he asked, his voice low, careful, and Emily looked up, meeting his gaze with the same calm clarity she had carried throughout. "I knew it needed to be seen," she replied, and the distinction settled between them. Simple but precise. He nodded slowly, as if understanding something beyond the words, then stepped back, leaving her to continue uninterrupted. Throughout the day, meetings were rescheduled, departments adjusted, and a quiet current of procedural movement flowed beneath the surface of routine operations, subtle but unmistakable, as if the organization itself had shifted into a different mode, one driven not by assumption, but by verification. Late in the afternoon, as sunlight stretched across the office floor in long, golden lines, the senior director stepped out of a conference room, pausing briefly as his gaze passed over Emily's desk, and though he did not speak, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not of approval, but of acknowledgment, the kind reserved for moments that redefine expectations without needing recognition. Emily returned her attention to the documents in front of her, her pen moving steadily across the page, her presence quiet but no longer invisible, because she had not changed who she was. She had only revealed what others had chosen not to see, and in doing so, she had altered more than a single moment. She had shifted the way the room itself understood truth, not as something dictated by position, but as something that stands, quietly and firmly, when someone is willing to let it be known. By the end of the week, the office no longer tried to pretend that nothing had happened, because truth, once introduced, has a way of expanding quietly into every corner until it becomes part of the structure itself, and the administrative review that had begun as a formal procedure now carried visible weight, shaping decisions, altering conversations, and redefining roles in ways that could not be reversed. Emily Carter continued her work with the same measured focus, her routine unchanged on the surface, yet the environment around her responded differently. Colleagues who once overlooked her now paused before speaking, choosing their words with more care, not out of fear, but out of awareness, as if the standard for what could be ignored had shifted permanently. Late Friday morning, an internal meeting was called, not large, not public, but significant in its composition. Senior leadership, compliance officers, and key department managers gathered once more in the same conference room where everything had changed days earlier. The polished table reflecting the overhead lights in a way that felt sharper now, more defined. Emily was not scheduled to attend, and she did not expect to be. because her role had never been about presence in the final decision. But as she worked quietly at her desk, a message appeared on her screen requesting her attendance, brief, direct, and without explanation, and she stood, gathering her notebook with the same steady motion, her expression unchanged as she walked toward the room. Inside, the atmosphere was different from before, less tense, more structured, as if uncertainty had been replaced by clarity, and when she entered, several individuals acknowledged her presence with subtle nods, not formal, not exaggerated, but intentional. The senior director spoke first, his voice calm, measured. "We have completed the preliminary review," he stated, his gaze moving briefly across the room before settling. "And the findings confirm consistent misuse of company assets and misrepresentation in expense reporting." The words were delivered without emphasis, but their meaning carried fully because no one in the room needed elaboration. Richard Lawson was not present, and his absence was no longer ambiguous. It was understood, accepted as part of the outcome already in motion. Another executive continued, outlining next steps, formal actions, adjustments to departmental oversight, reinforcement of compliance protocols, each statement precise, procedural, building a framework that would ensure the issue was not only addressed, but prevented from repeating. Emily listened without interruption, her posture composed, her attention steady, because this was not a moment of validation for her. It was the continuation of something larger than her involvement. After the discussion concluded, the senior director turned slightly toward her, not with ceremony, but with direct acknowledgment. "Your diligence in identifying these discrepancies has contributed to this process," he said, his tone even, "and it reflects the standard we expect across all levels of the organization." And though the statement was brief, it carried significance, not as praise, but as recognition of principle. Emily nodded once, a small, respectful gesture. "I followed the information that was available," she replied, her voice calm, her words consistent with everything she had demonstrated, and there was no need for further explanation, because the simplicity of her response carried its own clarity. As the meeting adjourned, people rose quietly, conversations resuming in low tones, but the atmosphere remained steady, grounded, as if the organization had absorbed the event and integrated its lesson without needing to repeat it. Emily stepped back into the hallway, the soft hum of the office surrounding her once more, unchanged in sound yet different in meaning. And as she returned to her desk, her presence settled back into its quiet rhythm, not diminished, not elevated, but aligned, because she had not sought attention, she had not sought authority, she had simply refused to look away, and in doing so, she had allowed the truth to do what it always does when given space. It had reshaped the structure, not through force, but through clarity. And that clarity, once established, remained long after the moment itself had passed. The days that followed did not carry drama. They carried adjustment, the kind that settles slowly but permanently, reshaping how people move, how they speak, how they choose what to notice and what to question. And within that quiet shift, the organization began to reflect something more deliberate, something more aware. Policies that once existed as background guidelines were now discussed openly in meetings, referenced with clarity, reinforced not as restrictions, but as standards that defined the integrity of the system itself. And employees who had once relied on assumption now approached their work with a different mindset, one that balanced trust with verification, not out of fear, but out of understanding. Emily Carter remained consistent through it all, her routine unchanged, her presence steady, as if the ripple she had created had passed through her and continued outward without altering her center. And that consistency became its own form of influence, quiet but undeniable, because it demonstrated that integrity was not situational. It was constant. One afternoon, as the office moved through its usual rhythm, a small group gathered near the break area, their voices low but engaged, discussing updates to internal reporting processes. And for the first time, the conversation did not revolve around compliance as an obligation, but as a shared responsibility, something that belonged to everyone rather than being enforced from above. Emily passed by without interrupting, but one of them paused, turning slightly toward her. "It is different now," he said, not as a question, but as an observation, and Emily offered a small nod. "It is clearer," she replied, her words simple, but carrying the essence of what had changed. Later that day, a revised internal memo circulated, outlining strengthened oversight procedures, updated approval systems, and clearer accountability structures, each point precise, structured, and grounded in the lessons drawn from recent events. And while the document did not reference individuals, its purpose was unmistakable. It was not just about correction, it was about prevention, about ensuring that clarity remained embedded in the system moving forward. As employees reviewed the memo, there was no resistance, no quiet dismissal, only acceptance, because the reasoning behind it had already been seen, already understood. In the late afternoon light, as shadows stretched across the office floor, Emily sat at her desk, reviewing a set of reports with the same careful attention she had always given her work, her pen moving steadily, her focus uninterrupted, and around her, the office moved with a rhythm that felt more grounded, more aligned, as if something previously overlooked had been brought into balance. Across the room, a manager paused briefly at her desk, not to ask a question, not to give direction, but simply to acknowledge her presence with a quiet, respectful nod before continuing on. And that small gesture reflected something larger, a shift not in hierarchy, but in perception, where value was no longer assigned by position alone, but by clarity, by consistency, by the willingness to see and act when it mattered. Emily did not respond beyond a slight nod of her own, her attention returning to her work, because she had never sought recognition. She had only acted when something required it, and now, as the system around her adapted and strengthened, her role returned to what it had always been, steady, precise, aligned with the principles she had followed from the beginning. And in that quiet continuation, the true impact of what had happened became clear, not in a single moment, not in a single decision, but in the lasting change it created, a shift that did not fade with time, because it was built on something deeper than authority, something that remains when everything else adjusts, the simple, enduring presence of truth, once it has been allowed to stand. Weeks passed, and what had once been a single moment in a quiet conference room settled into something far more enduring, not as a story people retold openly, but as a standard that shaped how decisions were made long after the details had faded from daily conversation. The office no longer felt defined by who spoke the loudest or who held the highest title, but by something more measured, more deliberate, a shared understanding that clarity mattered, that details mattered, that silence in the face of inconsistency was no longer acceptable simply because it was convenient. Emily Carter continued her work as she always had, arriving each morning with the same quiet focus, her steps steady across the polished floor, her notebook in hand, her presence calm and unassuming, yet no longer overlooked, because recognition had shifted from curiosity to respect, not the loud kind that draws attention, but the quiet kind that changes how people listen. She was no longer the intern who stayed in the background. She was the one who had seen what others had ignored and chosen not to look away, and that distinction did not elevate her above others. It simply aligned her with something they had all begun to value more clearly. Across the office, new routines had taken shape. Meetings included more questions, reports were reviewed with greater care, and decisions were no longer accepted without understanding, not because of fear of consequence, but because the cost of ignoring truth had already been revealed. Quietly but completely. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the glass walls and stretched across the desks in soft lines, the senior director paused near Emily's workspace, not interrupting, not demanding attention, but standing there just long enough to be noticed. And when she looked up, he gave a small nod, the same restrained acknowledgment he had offered before, and said, "Clarity is not always comfortable, but it is always necessary." His tone calm, his words measured, and Emily returned the nod with the same quiet certainty she had carried from the beginning, because she had never acted for comfort, only for what needed to be seen. He moved on without further comment, his steps steady, his presence no longer defined by authority alone, but by the balance that had been restored within the system he helped guide. Later, as the day drew to a close and the office gradually emptied, Emily gathered her things, placing her notebook into her bag with the same care she always had, her routine unchanged, her focus grounded, and as she walked past the conference room, where everything had begun, she did not pause, did not look inside, because the moment that had taken place there no longer belonged to a single room or a single event. It had moved beyond that, into the structure itself. Outside, the evening air carried a quiet stillness, the kind that follows a day of steady work, and as she stepped into it, her expression remained composed, unchanged, because nothing about her purpose had shifted, only the clarity around it. And in that quiet continuation, the true outcome became evident, not in recognition, not in status, but in the way the system now held itself, more aligned, more aware, shaped not by power alone, but by the willingness to see clearly and act with integrity when it mattered. Because in the end, authority can shape a room, but only truth can redefine it. And on that day, without raising her voice, without seeking attention, Emily Carter had done exactly that. And the silence that followed was not empty, it was complete.